So my focus for the conversation really today is less about what AI tools we use and more so what is the foundation we've had to create so that AI can be smarter and more accurate on how it thinks and how it supports and helps us. So I'm going to talk a lot about kind of decision discipline. And if there's really one key takeaway, it's what are the decisions that need to be made prior to the process, during the process, and after the process and engaging kind of AI. I'm going to focus around the evaluation lens. As I said, we have 19 social service programs. We evaluated every single one of them in a 9-month process, including creating the framework for analysis and evaluation and integrating AI into the process, not it becoming the sole process, but integrate it into different components of the process to evaluate all 19 programs in a consistent manner. So this is where AI is not primarily technical, it's a decision discipline around that. So what decisions do leaders need to make? So really, again, you're going to hear this a lot from me, is start with the leadership question, not the available data that you have. And I'll get back into that in a minute. What evidence would support confident action? So define the questions that funders, boards, program teams want answered. From information to judgment to action. The action is just as critical as the information gathering. So we took kind of an evaluation approach, and prior to jumping into the evaluation itself, we actually spent about 3 months creating an evaluation framework, which has kind of 5 pillars to that framework. And I'm going to focus on, and the talk will be about the first 2. One is about what most people think about evaluation. It's impact, outcomes, fidelity, compliance. Are we making a difference? The other aspect of that, the second pillar, is what strategic decisions do we need to make moving the organization forward, moving the program forward? Is it growth? Is it sunset? Is it pivoting it? Or is it holding steady? So making business decisions based off of the outcomes of this. So once we established the framework, and what's nice because then all 19 programs follow the exact same framework in the evaluation process. We started with identifying the questions. Before we used technology, we went to our program leaders and said, what are the questions we need to be asking? And so, because the immediate response from program leaders is, just give me the questions and we'll answer them. We've been using data since 2017, agency-wide. Just tell me what questions you want answered, we'll get it to you, and we're done. No. What are the questions we need to be answering? That's critical. It forced the program team to step outside of the box of, this is the data we have, so let's answer these questions. And it forced them to start thinking differently about, less about the data that they have, and more about, if we're trying to answer questions and we don't have data, how do we implement data collection to begin that so we can evaluate that for next cycle for this? We went into gathering the context. Now, in terms of AI, and I'll get into the details of how we use it a little bit later, gathering context was that we're in a position where we use Salesforce for all 19 of our social service programs. We have one system, one point of truth. We don't use multiple other systems. It's not fragmented. Think of us as like a healthcare system. We're on one electronic medical records system. There's one record per person, and there's one linked record per family, which allows us to have a lot of reliability and validity on our data. But it's not perfect. There are still gaps. And so we used our team in Salesforce to gather the contextual data. We didn't ask AI to pull it, because in gathering data, there's oftentimes nuances around that data. We may find that for early Head Start, when we assess early Head Start on a quarterly basis through the GOLDS assessment, that we could be missing data for a portion of kids for one particular quarter. AI wouldn't necessarily pick up on that, but our team of business analysts and our program directors would. So once we formulated the questions, then the team worked together to pull data and then provide context behind the data on that, which AI would have more difficulty seeing the nuances and that human component to that. From there, we assessed the evidence, so assessing the data, figuring out what gaps we have, don't have. We surfaced risks. So this is where AI came in handy because we looked at external. So everything up to here was internally focused on our programs. But we also work within the context of a bigger system, a bigger environment that impacts how we do our work. Government funding, philanthropy, the social setting beyond what we work has an impact on decision making and should be included in the decision making process. From there, we developed recommendations based off the evaluation. And then the most important thing, which oftentimes is the separation and where nonprofits kind of stop, is we define the actions. What is next? What are the action plans based on this evaluation? So each program leader has an action plan based on the evaluation and what comes next on a monthly, a quarterly, a biannual, and an annual basis. That they then gets embedded into their work performance standards, their team standards, and then becomes a tool that feeds into our strategic plan. So all kind of connected. So I'm going to cover, these are kind of 4 lessons that we learned from the field, and I'll go through each one of these individually. So I'm going to come back to start with the decision, not the data. So this means, and I covered this already, is start with the questions that you want to ask. It's the formative evaluation portion of evaluation. Start with the theory of change. What are we trying to get to? What questions do we want to answer? And what we did is pushed our teams to think about not as what questions the funders want answers to or the compliance regulators want answer to. So for example, there's standards in Head Start in terms of what the funders require, what the feds or the pass-throughs require, what scores are required through the goals assessment, show developmental growth in the 7 domains, on and on and on. But the question then is, what else does our team want to see? What do they see as impactful? Well, they see parent interactions. They see parent engagement in the process. But that's not anything that is recorded in the gold standard. So we start with asking the right questions, and from that we start to develop the tools needed to go beyond what funders and go beyond what compliance, and we kind of call it the CASL way. What is the CASL standards, not external standards? And we set the bar higher. And so that's really important. And this was a difficult thing for the program team because you're so used to just give me the questions, like funders do. Just give me the questions, I'll fill out the grant report, I'll give you the answers. And so challenging them to think beyond that was an exercise for them. But they started picking it up. A shared framework. So I talked, before we started this whole evaluation process, we created a shared framework. So the shared framework gives leaders really a common language to assess, because each of our divisions have several programs underneath of them. So we've got early Head Start, home visiting, we've got after school K through 5, middle school, high school. It's all run by the same division, but there are different standards and different processes through each one. So we looked at need and demand for programs. This is kind of more external. Implementation readiness. We also looked at client outcomes, the impact. Staffing and capacity was a big component into what we looked at. Funding and sustainability. So we looked at the 2 sides of the equation. We've got the program side, the impact. The other side of the equation is funding, sustainability, cost per unit of service. We looked at risk, internal risk, and especially external risk, which we all can relate to right now in the social service realm. We looked at strategic fit to our strategic priorities and strategic plan, which we're in the second of 3 years on. And we looked at opportunities for improvement. This evaluation was not about gotcha moments. It was really about how do we learn from where we're at and how do we constantly improve ourselves for better impact in the community. So who benefits from the shared language? Program leadership, finance, because how we evaluated was the same thing in program by program by program in the same consistent way. Advancement or fundraising, human resources, government affairs, we analyze things from the same perspective at the city, state, county, and federal government for risks, executive leadership, and even board governance and stakeholders. So one of the things that we really thought about in this process is we wanted to be kind of very clear that AI amplifies the structure and the process. It does not create it. If you rely on AI to create the process, it's not going to pick up the nuances of how you operate. It's not going to pick up the cultural nuances of your programs. It's not going to pick up sometimes the financial nuances of running a nonprofit, direct versus indirect rates. And so what we used AI for is really to synthesize notes, reports, and kind of source documents. We used it to identify reoccurring themes and patterns within a program and amongst divisions and amongst all the programs, comparing risks and opportunities, both internally and especially externally as well. Used it to draft findings. I mean, ultimately, the evaluation reports, 19 of them, 230 pages. And a summary report, 60 pages for leadership. That takes time, and to be honest with you, that can all be written by one person. So using AI to help draft the findings was very important. But again, just draft. You need to exercise critical thinking to review its findings and cross-reference those processes, translating insights for different audiences as well, because what the CEO needs to see will be very different than what program leaders need to see. What AI cannot replace is a lived program knowledge. Really, really important. That's why in the initial stages, we met with the program staff, we asked the questions, and they worked with the Salesforce team in CASL to look at the data, because there are qualitative aspects of the data, and there are sometimes gaps in the data that the system, the AI, would not pick up on. Ethical judgment and governance responsibility, key. Never give that up to AI. Human interpretation and final strategic decisions, those decisions need to come from us, not from AI. AI may make recommendations on that, which it is a useful tool for recommendations, but should never replace decision making. The most valuable outputs is really creating the operating discipline that AI helped us to kind of create. So we took a perspective, we're an Agile Scrum based organization. So we did 5 sprints over a 7-month period. We did 4 programs for each sprint. Each sprint was 6 weeks long. There was a very methodical process so that the program leaders became very used to that. They may not have a program evaluation in sprint 1, but they may have it in 2, and they may have it again in sprint 4. So it created a process that all the program leaders became very familiar with, and they knew the structure of, let's figure out what the questions are first, let's take a look at the internal data and evaluate amongst ourselves and as humans to do that, create the draft report, look at external variables, give the reports back to the program leaders and say, prove me wrong. Go through with a fine-tooth comb. Beat this up. Finalize the report, add it to the others, begin to publish, and then look at how does the relationships between each of the programs, from HR, from advancement, from leadership, finance, how do those all kind of merge together in reports that would help finance, that would help advancement. So where AI supported the evaluation, I kind of covered this already before. It synthesized notes, reports was very helpful in that. I think a lot of us, already use those functions, whether it's Microsoft Copilot, or whether it's some of the recording devices that will record and summarize meeting notes, very helpful. They're organizing risk and opportunities, especially when it comes to the external landscape. A lot of risks, a lot of unknown. AI was very useful in us looking at, for example, the federal budget, the state budgets, where are risks inherent to that, where are risks in the House draft bill compared to the Senate draft bill in the state compared to the governor's final bill. A lot of predictive analytics can go into that and help predict what is it going to look like, at the final stage in the process. Drafting summaries, which I kind of covered already. Identifying reoccurring themes among programs to programs, but also where we're assessing risk in the community, assessing risk in the government. What are some of the reoccurring themes? How is the federal impacts going to impact the state, which then flows down to the nonprofit organizations? Comparing potential scenarios in each departments and programs, and then really kind of translating the findings across departments. So I want to give you a case use here. So we did all the evaluations, all done. What we found we have a pro bono legal program that's been operating for about 15 years. The issue, and if any of you operate a pro bono legal program, I'm sure you'll know this, is funding. So our pro bono legal program, we have 2 full-time attorneys. Philanthropy covers half of it, 50%. The other half we just absorb through revenue generated from other programs. And we're lucky to be in a position to have other programs that do generate positive cash flow. So in looking through this, we recognize that the outcomes were phenomenal. The impact we're having is fantastic. The compliance is spot on. The staff are really, they're working hard. What we found is kind of 2 things. One, philanthropy wasn't covering it, and there were some issues on that. We overpromise, get underfunded, and then we overdeliver. So we're getting funded for 50%, and yet we're delivering at 200%. So what we looked at is, okay, how do we make this more sustainable? Because relying on pro bono is just not enough. We went out there, started asking questions. We started using AI to help do some research. How do other nonprofits using 990s, IRS components, how do other nonprofits that have pro bono or legal as part of their component do this? How do they make it work? And how do the ones with successful cash flow assets make this work? What we discovered is that there are nonprofits across the country, not a lot, but they do exist, that do a 2-lane approach. So the first lane is the typical pro bono, 200% federal poverty level and below. That's kind of the standard for grant making. The 200 to 400, which is the middle class, they're struggling because they cannot afford what I would call kind of the downtown $750 an hour attorneys, but yet they don't qualify for pro bono. They're too rich for that service. And so they're left in the middle without all the appropriate supports that they need. So we took a look at our own data. We were turning away 4 to 6 cases per month of people who didn't qualify for pro bono, but they can't afford. So from here, what we did is we've designed a kind of a 2-lane approach for legal services. We're going to be piloted in January. So we have a 6-month roadmap to where we've created a business plan around that. AI has helped. We've used that to create financial pro formas, build out pricing models for what we call flat pack services. Barriers to legal is not just price, but it's often that people don't know how much the attorney bill is going to end up with all said and done. So creating a flat pack that makes law accessible to people, but still provides a revenue generation that can then support the pro bono side of things. And so where did AI kind of fit into this process? It did the evaluation, which said we have a funding issue. We don't have an impact, compliance, or fidelity issue. We have a funding issue, which we knew, but it provided us phenomenal clarity on, especially with attorney utilization. That's where it helped in that. It also helped us build out the model. Now, here's the important thing. We have now reached out to the providers, the American Bar Association, Chicago Bar Association. We reached out to providers in New York, LA that are doing this work to validate all of this stuff. And there are some things that we've learned, like, okay, we need to actually kind of include that in our thought process. So this is where, when it comes to AI, it can help build out models, but it's so important to cross-check and validate those with real life, real human experiences in that process. So I think if there's one thing that is really the takeaway from this, it's really kind of start with the decision or start with the question. And Craig said this earlier on, start with the question, not the data. Because if you only start with the data that you have, your question is always going to fulfill just that data points, and it's never going to let you look beyond that process. So we don't need to necessarily fully participate, but think about in your organization, name a decision that your organization needs to make in the next 90 days. What is the evidence that you have that already exists that can help to inform that decision? And then what's missing or inconsistent? And then find AI's role in that. AI should not solve this for you, but AI can play a role in gathering information. Thank you all.